has been really instrumental in my education of learning about native plant communities. So I really owe the group so much, and I'm just really appreciative to have this opportunity. Um, I'm excited to share what I have for you here. And I'm going to bring it all the way back to the beginning, and we are going to cover some of the fundamentals today. So I'm going to start things off with just putting some context to evolutionary history and how we have the species we have today. And after I finish that first section, I'm going to take a little break so you guys will have the opportunity to grill me with some questions, or if you have any comments, feel free to let me know. And then in part two, I'll dive a little deeper into some of the ecological considerations we deal with in the field these days. And again, after I wrap that up, there'll be more Q&A potential. And then I'll wrap it all up with some of the projects we are currently doing with the Sonoma Ecology Center and some of the approaches we are using. So after I did my my research project on prescribed fire to stop yellow star thistle, I went on and taught for 3 years in evolution and ecology, and the students just kept bringing such great questions that I got so interested in just the theory of evolution and how all of these things came to be. And it just really heightened my appreciation for biodiversity at large and kind of reaffirmed all the work I've been putting into the restoration field. And I've been trying to, dig into it and figure out, really if I can date back, how long has this hummingbird been sipping from this epilobium? And if you go back in time, you can see, birds are going 150 million years back, flowering plants over 100 million years back. We're just a little blip on the radar. We've only been here in the West, in Western colonialism, 500 years. I think indigenous cultures go back to 10,000 years. So the species around us have been there for some time, and they really deserve our respect. And what shaped all of these species? Well, boil it down to simple Darwinian concepts of survival of the fittest. And those theories were confirmed later after he presented all those things. And it seemed to really be, the mechanism for adaptation and diversity is this, survival of the fittest structure that kind of shapes speciation. And it's just a fascinating concept. Here you can see the moth with the proboscis that went down the deep floral tube of the orchid 130 years after he proposed that hypothesis. But, I think one thing that I really is near and dear to me is just ecology, the field of ecology. And it kind of branches out from, just strictly survival of the fittest, and it's not that basic. There are so many interesting interactions of species that make up our web of life that we're just one of them, and we're just trying to understand it as we're manipulating it, and it's really complex. And we're coming to learn more about all these things. Like, it's not just plants out there. We have underground mycorrhizal networks connecting all of these communities that shape our ecosystems that we're still learning about. And one of the things I think is most fascinating that we rarely encounter in the field are looking at these obvious examples of these mycorrhizal networks where we have these really interesting kind of mushroom flowers coming out of the mycelial networks where, they're borrowing sugars from other plants. Are they parasitic? No, they're actually symbiotic, and we don't even really understand what sort of roles they're playing out in the forest. I've seen pollinators visiting them. There's an amazing diversity of these mycotrophic species out there. And it's those sort of subtle species that we will lose through development and impact. We can restore, fundamental keystone plants, but you can't propagate a mycotrophic flower in a nursery. Maybe one day we can with enough lab work, But these are the complexities of all of the little intricacies of the web of life that are so important for us to understand and actively steward. And how fortunate are we to live in California, the biodiversity hotspot on Earth, where we just have this amazing assemblage of dramatically different ecosystems. And how cool is it that the Native Plant Society is fanned out and has chapters in each of these locations? You can, head up to the White Mountains and visit the bristlecone pine, go out to the Mojave, spend some time with the Joshua trees or the old growth redwood forest, Lost Coast. I mean, dramatically different species, communities and ecological communities out there, a very rich place in diversity. And, I'm a field guy at my heart. So I go out there and I do a lot of hard work. Now I lead my crew doing hard work. And sometimes it's so tough, you got to find some inspiration. And I find my inspiration in now pursuing diversity. So when I'm not out in the field pulling broom or finding resources to pull broom or other top invasive threats, I'm out there with my camera trying to find new species, and it's just like a treasure hunt of diversity. It has really kept my juices flowing over the years. And, here, the calocordyces on the top there, kind of like the star of native flora. We have calocordis right here in Sonoma. On the Van Hoosier Preserve, we have one in peril. The calocordis uniflora is just barely hanging on. Lots of endemics all over the place. Then the next row down, those are all the liliums, lots of beautiful lilies. The one fourth over from the right there, the white one is Lilium rubescens. We have here in the Myakima range, and just a stunning flower, endangered, hanging on. And then the Mimulus, now Erythranthe or Diplicus, so much diversity out there. It is a splitter's dream. And this one on the far bottom right there, the Douglas mouse ear mimulus, I just located right here in the Myakima. I never thought I'd see that in the Bay Area. So it is just really a fascinating place to be here in Sonoma, and truly grateful to help take care of what we have here. And, when you look at all this diversity, it's species supporting species. So we have the pipevine swallowtail here, supported by the monkey flower, and we have, or supported by the Dutch pipevine. And then we have the milkweed here supporting monarchs. So they're providing habitat and nectar resources for wildlife. It is just amazing. And then I'm starting to learn more and more of wildlife. As I've dove into plant ecology, we don't get to, look at the things with the faces too much, but here come the pollinators. We've got the sphinx moth visiting the primrose. There's our hummingbird sipping off the fuchsias. Probably many of you have these in your front yards. And I just came to learn the pipevine seeds are actually distributed from these vespid wasps. When my wife and I were seed collecting them, we had them out on the deck. And what's going on here? Here come the vespid wasps to grab a hold of those pipevine seeds. It's just amazing. And then down on the bottom there, I couldn't believe this. Ants distribute the seeds of trillium through the redwood forest. I mean, it's just beyond belief amazing. Unfortunately, right, with the pressure of development and disturbance, we are losing species, our networks are breaking down, and that's why this field is so important. So with that, I'd like to set up the first Q&A here. Oh, I also have the map here that shows the biodiversity, the distribution of biodiversity across the US. And you can see highlighted here in California just how important these resources are and how they are really facing the brink of all this pressure. We're losing species faster than ever. It's more important than ever we take care of them properly. And with that, I believe now we're ready for the Q&A.
So far, it's pretty quiet out there. I'm sure everyone's just enjoying the pictures of all the biodiversity we have here.
Cool. Well, I'm gonna
There
keep
might be more later on.
Nice, nice. Well, yeah, I can keep rolling.
Yeah, I think I'm waiting to see if I can't see if anyone is. Oh, we've got a question. Natasha says, what do you think of Doug Tallamy's efforts to create biodiversity in the urban sector?
Yeah, I mean, that's tough. From doing a lot of restoration, I've come to learn that there are resilient natives and there are sensitive natives. And it seems to be that some of these native species really need to have, intact ecosystems neighboring them to kind of share some of those mycorrhizae. Some of the natives grow incredibly slow, like a half an inch to an inch per year. Others are pretty tough. I mean, you get the juncuses in there, some tough woody shrubs. There's a plant palette to meet every need, I believe, out there. And I don't know, that's a difficult question. That's a tough one. I mean, often I always source it to, what's most local to that watershed. And then I boil it down to, what's going to thrive in this given landscape, looking at the soils, the compaction, the sun exposure, everything. Hopefully you find the right plant for the right place, and then it's good to go for 100, 300, 500 years, who knows?
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting question for you, since you deal with restoring much larger areas generally, but also have some experience working in nurseries and in propagation as well. So it's a good question. That's the only one we've got so far. So I'll be back. We'll be back in a little bit. Thanks for the next question that just came in, but we'll get it next time.
All right. Well, moving on. So now we're getting into the nitty gritty here to some degree. So what's happening to the biodiversity out there? Well, there are two major impacts. One is development itself, so paving it over. No life is going to exist in that. And actually, after you develop that space, to get life to re-exist within it is very challenging in most cases. And then you've got invasive species displacing native species as an effect of disturbance. So essentially, I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is the plants 101 I used to give to my students. And how do you tease apart all this stuff? I think it's really important to do that, because people who focus on invasive plant control, they're not just out to kill plants. They're actually out there to preserve life. And when you look at these different types of plants, they really do have completely different roles, right? Native plants, they've been here forever. They belong here. They're providing ecosystem services. Ornamental plants, we pay for them. We get something from them. They do not really pose a threat. They might require excess water, excess fertilizer, but they're not bad just because they're exotic. It's not like we're waging a war on exotic species. It's really these invasive plants. And what makes a plant invasive? Well, there are a lot of things, but, I shouldn't back up to, why do we care about invasive species? Well, we're the ones who are directly responsible for introducing them. This is not a natural phenomenon. We took these invasive plants, either intentionally or not, and introduced them to a new land. Why do we care about that? Well, there's the economic consequences of really invasive plants, like star thistle degrading forage or arundo blocking waterways. Those plants tend to get a lot of attention. And then there's the things we get back from, native plants. There could be medicine and chemicals within these plants we don't even understand yet. They're out there pollinating our food. A native bee, I heard, pollinates 25 times faster than a European honeybee. So these, these native pollinators are essential for food production. We have like some momentum going with hedgerows out in ag lands, which is great. And then there's the moral implications of, well, every species has a right to exist on Earth. Who are we to decide that? And, when you look at invasive species, what's so bad about them? Well, since they've escaped the natural process of evolution, they're able to outcompete the plants around them. And when they steal their light, their water, and their nutrients, they displace them and become invasive. So when you have a monotypic stand of just one plant, it has essentially driven out the diversity of that landscape, which is a major problem. And there are plenty of examples out there. If you've been to a mature eucalyptus forest, you're probably well acquainted with the lack of understory and just the thick eucalyptus duff out there, and how much water they're sucking up to, impede aquatic organisms. It's really challenging. And when we go out to control these plants, there's a lot of things to consider. Is this an annual plant? Is this a perennial plant? Is this plant reproducing sexually or clonally? Did this plant come from the northern or southern hemisphere? That can affect its flowering time and its reproductive cycles. How is it going about spreading seed? And then it becomes really important that we keep track of their dispersal and where they're located, and mapping efforts become imperative for control. And what sort of tools do we have out there to control them? Well, there's the good old fashioned doing it with your hands and getting out there and just pulling ivy, bagging it up. It works. There's mechanical. This is something I really focus in. It's like getting that equipment and using the right tool for the right job and having the right training to do it properly. There's cultural uses like prescribed fire, which is, after doing my first prescribed fire, it's pretty challenging getting the resources and the prep work and getting all the permits and finding a good burn boss and getting the support from CAL FIRE. But when you do it right, it's a beautiful thing. Grazing. A lot of people lean towards grazing. I think both grazing and prescribed fire are good tools in the toolbox, but it really boils down to timing and duration of how long is that herd going to be in that space? What's the concentration of the herd in that space? What sort of livestock are you using? There's a big difference between sheep and goats and cattle, and are they transporting invasive species when they're in there? What plant species is desirable forage for each of those particular types of livestock? Are they going to go after native plants? I believe we've lost, rare species due to grazing. I don't think they're a blanket solution out there. They're just one of the tools in the toolbox. And then the most hardcore of all are the chemical applications. And, this is a last resort. This is when everything else does not work and this plant is going to wipe out everything in its path. That is when you break out the chemicals. And I really firmly believe in this being the last resort. And it does sadden me when I work with colleagues who lean on it as a first resort when it can be done with any of the above. And I think it really needs to be more heavily regulated. We have a lot of awareness on Roundup and glyphosate, but really a lot of these other chemicals are just as powerful. And I really feel like there needs to be, there are all these qualifications, seen plenty of people with them. A lot of people who condone the use of herbicide are not the ones actually using the herbicide. And the people in this line of work are good people. And our policy at the Sonoma Ecology Center is we would rather do it so that we know it's done right. But really, I do believe that there is room to grow in kind of the enforcement and really diving into the proper use of chemicals. And, getting to know these ecological communities, it's really hard to just jump into a project. I think getting to know your landscape, getting to know your resources, I mean, that could take years. This is just kind of like the timing and flow that I use for addressing some of the top tiered invasives. But, there's a calendar for all the natives out there too. And looking at when you're going in to do these controls, is it going to have adverse effect on other native species? So really there's an ideal optimal timing window for everything you take on. And you have to throw in the invasion curve for every invasive species presentation. I think that it's a really powerful concept. I dream of the day when we all take care of our landscapes around us and we all understand the composition of the places we like to recreate in, and every person going for a walk on their favorite trail actively participates in taking care of that space. If we were able to reach that point in a society, we would be able to contain invasive species before they take off. And early eradication is so important for controlling these plants. The longer they're there, the more they reproduce, the more resources it takes to control them. And this is incredibly important right now with these firestorms everywhere, because it's kind of wiping the slate clean, and you see directly what the land use history was of that site. And if there was any level of disturbance, invasive species are fire adapted as well, and they're surging in most cases. The other tragic thing is, as equipment's going in to cut these dozer lines, that's additional disturbance. They're tracking invasive species into intact habitat areas. We can control that if we get out ahead of it and don't let them start to reproduce in these new locations and essentially pollute our watersheds. Now, the difference of eradication versus control. One thing that's frustrating in this line of work that really got to me when I was at the bottom there working with my friends, is when you're just kind of pigeonholed on one property and you're seeing the invasives come in from above. You're seeing the source populations that you can't even reach. In my opinion, that's just wasted resources, right? You could be maybe lessening their seed bank, but if it's just going to repopulate in, let's open up the borders. Let's start coming in with sound watershed approaches to make a sizable long-term impact. It can't really be so piecemeal. Dealing with the Sonoma Valley here, we've got 85% of the land in private hands. So, if we're just working on these little slivers of public spaces, we're never going to get ahead of the problem. We have to involve the community. We have to get people out there. We have to get people actively engaged with the landscape. And then it does take some education and knowledge to kind of come up with, well, what are our top priorities and how are we going to approach this most effectively, and develop a long-term approach that's going to get you the results you want. Coming up with the budgets for these projects is not easy. And oftentimes efforts are expended and there is no follow-up to do that follow-up monitoring and control. I think that's really important if you're going to win these battles, and you can. If we stay on it, they can be won. And that ends part 2.
Thanks. So there was a question asked right before we moved on from the last Q&A section, and that was, how do we determine what to grow in an area that has been grazed for decades? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Grasslands are incredibly complex, and that's why I chose to focus on them for my graduate research. And I'm going to touch on it a little bit in the next section. But Grasslands have been the most impacted of all California ecosystems. It's thought to have as little as 1% native species composition across the board in California grasslands. We've lost more plants in California grasslands than any other ecosystem. We've done a good job of preserving our redwood forests and some of our woodlands. The grasslands have been largely neglected for the most part and used, for economic benefits like grazing and agriculture. So they've really been divvied up and hit pretty hard. When you're out in a grassland, there is so much active turnover between annual species that it's all driven by seed bank and resources. So it's really tough. I think whenever I step into any environment, I basically expand out to the watershed and try to find the most intact area I can find, and then I'll actually start returning to that place over time, just making observations and notes of what sort of species I'm seeing out there, and then start, getting the permits and the permission to start doing some seed collection and propagation. And that becomes active restoration. So I'll touch on that a little more in the next section.
Great, thanks. Another question out there. How can we control broom along flood channels?
Woo, that's a big one. And I'm definitely going to get into that on the next one too. This final section, I talk more about applied techniques, and I dive a little bit into specific species. But I will be doing another presentation with Devin Friedfeld at Pepperwood on Thursday at 10:30, and we are going to get really into species by species recommendations. I'm happy to answer all those questions though after this presentation, and broom is not an easy one. Broom has been my arch nemesis since I set foot in the North Bay. And I have won battles and I have lost battles and I have learned a lot along the way. So maybe I'll hold off on that until I get some visuals to kind of back that up.
Sounds good. Yeah. Yeah, broom is tough. Okay, there's one more question that just came up, and I think it's something that probably is on a lot of people's minds. After these wildfires, there are many people looking for opportunities to help preserve the environment and protect these areas from invasive species. Do you have ideas or recommendations for how folks can get involved with that effort?
Yes, that's a great question. So basically, everybody wants to get involved in the post-fire work. There are lots of avenues to do so. I think maybe something I wouldn't recommend is trying to re-veg the landscape right off the bat. And I see people, ordering seed packs. Most of those come from Southern California. It's not really good to spread those genetics around. It's tough. I mean, in terms of like vegetation composition, we deal with this a lot in prescribed fire, where we go get these resources so that we can start playing with trajectories and resource allocation after the fires. When it's a wildfire, you don't have any control over that. And I think focusing on invasive species is the most important thing. A lot of times natives will rebound on their own. A lot of them, most of them are fire adapted, and we see them coming back strong after the fire if those resources are intact. If they're completely diminished and as fire frequency intensifies, we can start to see those resources decline. So I think one thing I would maybe recommend is getting some of like the keystone species per watershed kind of collected. Like, one thing that people don't talk a lot about that is so important are the perennial grasses. And I think it makes a lot of sense to just have like neighborhoods or communities kind of come up with maybe like seed bank resources by watershed, because if you're getting those perennial grasses, they are going to help keep those soils intact. After the fire season, we're going to get rain, we're going to get erosion. It impacts water quality. So, you know, the Sonoma Ecology Center has been really instrumental in all this. And I think that's one of the reasons why they brought me on. After the Nuns fire, when all the structures burned, we just wanted to keep those toxins from getting into our waterways. So we went out, started putting in waddles, started getting volunteers active, and, you know, containing those toxins from the structures before they're able to reach, you know, the waterways. And then now we've been actually getting support from the county and the watershed task force. So, you know, we have some funding to go out and do sediment control, erosion control. What there isn't the funding for is invasive plant control or re-veg. And I would love to at least focus on, you know, re-vegging our riparian systems. If they're daylighted, it's pretty hard. If they're not going to rebound, I think that's a good use of efforts. You know, when I saw the re-oaking movement, we actually got too many oak trees, and the oaks were coming back pretty good. Now we're starting to see, you know, some loss after the third year, but I think a lot of these plants can regenerate on their own if given the opportunity to do so. Now, can they competitively compete with the invasives if they're, you know, up against it? Probably not. So I think the invasive control becomes like most paramount in this post-fire situation. And how can people get involved? I would say look towards your regional nonprofits, right? Look towards the Pepperwood Preserves and the Sonoma Ecology Centers and the Laguna Foundations. They're going to have volunteer opportunities in place, or know people who do.
Right. Yeah, I also I think it's really interesting that you mentioned a lot of those places, those organizations have land and preserves that have burned not just this year, but last year or in the Nuns fire. And so there are various stages of recovery to get involved with depending on which organization you're working with, and that what you're doing for post-fire recovery may vary based on that too. So there's a lot of different ways to get involved, and it, as Jason said, I think really depends on the fire too, and the frequency. So that is a great question. I think that's all that has come in during this Q&A. We will stop again at the end, so if you're wondering about anything, just feel free to drop it in there and we'll get to it.
All right. Yeah, this one gets a little more in detail. In this section, I'm actually going to be talking about some of the work we're doing in some of our major ecosystems, so riparian forests, oak woodlands, and California grasslands. We have such a beautiful watershed here in the Sonoma Valley, and Upper Sonoma Creek has some of the best habitat for our remaining steelhead salmon. So we do a lot of work in the riparian. And when you're out there in the riparian, you don't see as many flowers, but it's just a wonderful place. That shaded, cool environment, all your shade-loving plants. There's some pretty special ones out there. The spice bush is such an amazing plant. All of our little seep monkey flowers and our scarlet monkey flower. I've been seeing sneezeweed around more often than I would have thought. We actually have leopard lilies around in the Myakama. Interesting peas. Yeah, lots of things going on there. Wild azaleas right here. And what's displacing this stuff? Some pretty nasty ivies. Cape ivy is one of the worst out there. That is definitely an early detection plant. So if you guys see any ivies out there with the Lisa Simpson haircut and some purple in the stem, that is a top-tiered invasive that needs to be controlled. The sooner the better. So, you know, we go out, we use contractor bags, we very delicately bag up each one of these all that plant material, because any fragment, if it gets loose, can reroot. So it's a major issue. English ivy is actually a little easier to control. These can both be controlled manually, so it's really just handwork. And English ivy, we just tear it all out, roll it up into these big old balls of ivy yarn, and then just let it decompose upon itself. And it really works. I mean, very little follow-up work required to take out substantial English ivy populations. One other plant I've been seeing kind of erupt in our waterways is the silver wattle acacia. It seems to come on strong, especially after fire. And we have a lot of invasive trees actually in the riparian forest. Tree of heaven is another really bad one. We have a lot of privets. We have some catalpa. There are seem to be more and more invasive trees moving in. And that tree of heaven and this acacia, and arundo, they're all not only invasive but extra fuels, extra fire fuel. So unfortunately, a lot of those plants do require chemicals for control. So what we're doing is something called a cut and paint, where, you know, right after we take it down with a chainsaw, we use a very small amount of herbicide directly to the trunk of the tree, and we get very high kill rates. And then we tend to re-veg wherever we're removing invasives. So willow staking is a great thing, a free resource. You get your watershed local genetic right there. Cut some willow sprigs, sprig them in right where you took out your acacias. You know, restore the canopy. It's a great, great thing. Man, do we have a lot of Armenian blackberry or Himalayan blackberry in this county, and it is a tough one. That is something that's kind of insurmountable unless you go in with the right tools. So we use power hedge trimmers to get the biomass out. We've been now using pole power hedge trimmers, which is nice. You get a little more space. And what we're doing is just removing all the biomass, and then we actually leave like the root stock about 6 inches to 10 inches high. And then we'll come back in in the rainy season with some picks and some earth tools and start getting the roots out. And you can wipe it out. You can get ahead of it. And here's a rundo. This thing is a major menace. It grows fast. It is really hard to kill. It spreads by root fragments in the flood rainy season, and it is taking off. I mean, it's erupted in some parts of California so bad. Up in Yolo County, they just got a grant for $1 million of arundo control up there. That's been making its way into the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, where we've been having a leading role in the arundo controls there. But it's a really tough plant. It does require chemicals to control it. We are doing work right now comparing two techniques. One, removing the biomass, treating the resprouts, and another actually sticking with my predecessor's technique of treating the entire plant so you get the foliar translocation down to the root ball. But arundo is a tough cookie. And in our oak woodlands, you know, kind of like the staple of Sonoma wine country, of our Sonoma landscapes, you get into these understories in the spring, and it is just so lush with diversity. This really drew me in when I was young, finding all these cool flowers hiding under the oaks, and just seeing them get wiped out by broom was really a motivator. And the brooms, man, are they a menace. So, you know, Scotch broom, it comes in really thick in the Pacific Northwest. It has a deeper taproot. It is really tough to remove. Fortunately, it tends to grow slower and spread slower. The one we really are plagued with here on the Central Coast is French broom. French broom, it's a nasty one. It's perennial, it's woody, it grows fast. It's a nitrogen fixer, so it pumps that earth full of fertilizer and reinforces its own growth. The seed bank is immense. You know, one plant can make thousands of seeds. It's a really challenging plant to deal with, but it is really rewarding when you can get ahead of it and beat it. And that's what we do. So anytime we see an isolated stand of broom, we remove it and we map it, and then we monitor it until it's gone. Um, when we have fields of broom moving in post fire, that becomes really interesting. Essentially, what's happened there is the fire wiped out all that broom, released the seed bank, and did a ton of work for you. So you didn't have to do the first wave of removal, the fire did. Now you have a crazy resurgence in seed bank. And if you're able to nip that in the bud, literally, and contain all that before it reproduces, you can set that broom back in a major way. Fortunately, it takes 2 years for it to actually reach reproduction, sometimes 3. So you have a little bit of time. But if you don't get it before it flowers, and then you have this whole lush field of broom putting in new seeds, now you've got a serious situation. So when we have a situation like on the right there, that's along Sonoma Creek after the Nuns fire, I pulled all the volunteers I could, and we went into the habitat corridor that connects Sonoma Mountain with the Myakima Range right there. And we were able to clear several acres of broom in the rainy season, and it's looking good. And not only did we clear it, we actually monitored it while we were doing it. After years of doing this work and throwing out these principles, I know how to beat broom. It takes 3 pulls, 2 years apart, and you deplete the seed bank, and there it goes. Now, one removal effort is not going to do it. It's actually going to make it worse. The second removal effort, you actually start to get ahead of it. And then the third removal effort, it's gone. So it's a 6-year process. I shouldn't say gone. It's about 90% gone. And then you do spot monitoring until it's gone. But yeah, you can beat it. So what we did there in Sonoma Creek, we did a mowing treatment, a herbicide treatment, and a manual treatment. And I'm getting the numbers now to show the efficacy of all this stuff. And April Owens, Milo Baker member, she brought us in Marin to lead a pretty large scale broom removal project through the Habitat Corridor project on a private property right there by the Civic Center in Marin County. And this place had not burned, but it was lush with French broom. So this was a great opportunity to do what I call the Hopscotch Approach, where I'm basically separating removal efforts by drainages. So we hit everything in the yellow in the first year here in 2020. Now in 2021, this coming wet season, we're going to clear the area in the red, and then everything in the yellow will have resurged. We go back in 2022, wipe that out, then hopscotch back to the red in 2023, wipe that out, and now we're actually shifting the trajectory and getting our understory back. It's a lot of work, but you know what? If you actually pull broom in the rainy season, it's a wonderful thing. A 6-foot plant has like a 3-inch root, and you can pop it out so easily, and it's just in a couple hours, you can clear a huge amount of space. We were able to do this with my team. We cleared that whole area of the yellow in, I think it was about 2.5 weeks. And this is what we're seeing here post-fire. And it's a little scary. What we're seeing in Sonoma County following the Tubbs fire in Fountain Grove is this eruption of seed bank. And you can see the devastation to the oak canopy. A lot of that epicormic growth we're actually seeing dying off, and we're losing the oaks we thought would resurge. And what we're left now is actually increased ladder fuels coming in from the next wave of broom. And I think it's going to be, I mean, I hate to say this, but if we don't get ahead of it, I could see this becoming an epidemic in coastal California, where we start losing oak woodlands to monotypic broom stands. So we really need to start getting ahead of this and start having sound approaches, or we're not going to win this battle, and we're actually going to have more fuel than we had before the fire, which is a scary thought. Now, out in the grasslands, a really dynamic ecosystem, tons of diversity hanging on out there. Lots of flowers, lots of annuals, wonderful place. And what's wiping those things out? Some really aggressive grasses, some pretty nasty thistles. There are a bunch of thistles out there. Each thistle should get its separate style of control. There is no universal technique for handling thistles. Each one is a little different. I've done a lot of work on yellow star thistle. What you want to do is contain it before it turns into what you have there on the left. And once it reaches that scale, you're looking at either a ton of chemicals, which is not okay with me, or you're looking at prescribed fire. Prescribed fire is the technique where you can actually decrease invasive plants and increase native plant diversity, but it takes a lot of subsequent years. You have to do it 3 years back to back. And once you drive all that bad stuff out of there, you probably are going to have to replace it with some good stuff, or you're probably going to have it come back again. And we work on star thistle, we work on barbed goat grass, and then we work on Medusa head. And Medusa head seems to be all over Sonoma County. If you see barbed goat grass, that's a really good thing to control because it will overtake Medusa head. So we rank barbed goat grass #1, then Medusa head comes next. Medusa head is especially nasty because every year you let it go to seed, it just gets thicker and thicker, and over time it forms this really thick, almost silica-rich mat that depletes, that hampers the ability of all the native annuals to actually germinate through that mat. So it's a great thing to introduce fire into those landscapes. Here's us controlling barbed goat grass. We have an emergent population we return to and actually bag up all the seed heads. And we're seeing the population decrease. Then on the right, I'm bagging up yellow star thistle following the Kincaid fire up on the Modini-Myakama Preserve. And they had next to no resources to control these post-fire invasives. They have amazing endemic plants up there. It's just, I put everything I had into getting the county to support us to go in there and start doing invasive plant control. And we were able to protect some of the major serpentine areas up there and have a pretty substantial impact. I mean, same thing, every one of these plants has a couple thousand seeds in it. So, you know, you stuff a bag full of that, you got hundreds of thousands of seeds you're stopping from spreading over the landscape. And here's our prescribed fire we pulled off this spring into summer. We did it in May, and the optimal timing window, textbook perfect 35-acre prescribed fire at the Van Hoosier Preserve. We had over 90% Medusa head cover. It's a wildflower preserve, and we started to see the numbers come down, and I can't wait to see that diversity come back. And since we were able to get in there in May, right when the standing seed was on there, you have about a 2 to 3 week window to introduce the fire right at that time. And unlike star thistle, what they've seen on pepperwood is you can actually get a 90% drop in 1 year of fire if you do it during the optimal timing window. And just like rotating cattle through, it's all timing, right? Prescribed fire is not ecological just because it's fire. Prescribed fire has to be done properly. All those, when you introduce fire to a landscape, you need to go out there and collect a ton of resources before you do. So that you can start re-vegging into that burned landscape. a lot of these fires, you don't really want to do them in the fall. That's not gonna hamper invasive growth. It might actually promote it. So I think just like grazing, there needs to be a lot more awareness on the optimal timing windows to introduce this fire. Now, fortunately, for a lot of the grassland invasives, that window is early May, and that's before fire season really ramps up. And it's a great opportunity for fire crews to get out there and get some on the ground experience. So it's a big old win-win if you can get all the everything lined up, all the ducks lined up to get those prescribed fires to happen. And I learned a ton. It took me probably a year and a half to make that fire happen, and I learned so much along the way, and all the hoops you need to jump through. And it was just amazing to see it done and see it done properly. And I can't recommend Phil Dye enough. He's an amazing burn boss. He had that thing running smooth. But just like how he describes it, it's like doing a paint job. 90% of it's the prep work. And that's something nobody really talks about. You know, to cut those breaks around that 35 acres was not an easy feat. And but it was all that much more satisfying to see it done properly and have it burn over so smoothly. So we're really excited about seeing some of the results of that. And we went out, we got preliminary monitoring before the fire took place. And we're going to gauge, you know, how well the natives come back. I did a bunch of seed collection too, so we'll be doing outplanting plots and trying to build in some research to the on the ground work whenever possible. And you know, this is what I focused on for my graduate research, and it just raised so many interesting issues to me as I started diving into the literature on it, and kind of fulfilled to me the whole process of this. So it seems to be, from what I've observed over the years, is that the people doing the strenuous on the ground work tend to have like a narrow focus, right? Of, okay, I have to control this star thistle, or I have to get this broom. Oftentimes the people doing that strenuous work don't have the skill set to understand all of the native plant composition of that area. That becomes really important because once you're actually able to drive those bad guys out of town, you probably will need to do some active restoration to put some good guys back in there, or the bad guys are going to come right back. And we're seeing that cycle continue in the invasive plant control field. And I feel like we can break it up from practicing holistic restoration. And I'll get a little bit into that. So, like I mentioned before, it really boils down to resource allocation. So what I mean by that is what's going on in the seed bank? What is the history of disturbance of that site? If it's plowed over or it got grazed heavily for 300, 500 years or so, or 300 years, it's not going to have a lot of natives left. That's where you might have to do some active restoration. If you're able to actually get those resources back, can natives compete? Yeah, they actually can. Seed Bloom out of Cal Academy of Science, he did a wonderful study where he was able to control non-native annual grasses and outplant perennial native grasses, not just Stipropulchra, but a whole bunch of perennial grasses, and found that the native perennial grasses could actually outcompete the invasive annuals when given the chance to do so, when the playing field is leveled out and the resources are actually even Steven. If they're at a disposition, they're never going to be able to competitively compete. So that's where active restoration comes in. And you know, in my study, I tested 6 different native taxa against the resurgence of star thistle, and it turns out that most of them actually couldn't handle the resurgence of star thistle. But what the one that did was Grandelia camporum, and it dramatically suppressed star thistle resurgence in a major way. So I feel like there's a lot to actually looking at like co-geners, and family relatives, and looking at, you know, if you see an invasive species sprawling over a landscape, is that actually a symptomatic condition from disturbance? And is it actually just fulfilling a niche role of that ecosystem? And if you're going to control that, how are you going to fulfill that niche role? Because nature will find a way to get that function back. So we need to get it back to how it once was. That's what restoration is all about. And I think that's where we need to go these days, a holistic approach to these things. And that's the end of my main talk, but I did just want to touch on a couple other exciting projects we've got going with the Sonoma Ecology Center. One major project I've been really pushing for is to start doing fuel reduction with ecology in mind. And that's something that you think would be the stage one approach, but it seems to be a novel concept, which is just crazy to me. And I've been a part of these fuel projects over the years and seen a lot of damage done. I've seen a lot of habitats get completely wrecked from fuel reduction work, and it's just devastating. And it doesn't have to be that way. When you look at like the most aggressive plants, a lot of the times they're invasive species. The invasive species are the ladder fuels. They're the flashy fuels. Anytime you want to get the biomass out of there, I start with invasive plants, and I'll pull, I mean, we'll pull so much invasive biomass out of there. We don't even need to touch a native resource, and we just took a ton of fuel out of the landscape. I mean, it's all variant on, you know, what you're dealing with. Our big project in Napa up there, we're doing a 30-acre ridgeline break on the Napa Ridge, and it's Douglas fir encroached. So basically, we're just dropping every Douglas fir that's under 8 inches and taking that down, and then we're going to pile burn it, and we're leaving all the bigger life stage trees to come into their own. We're also like selectively thinning, so we're looking out for endangered Napa Falls indigo bush. We're looking out for, you know, any other unique species that we might encounter and saving that. So we're maintaining diversity in the landscape as we're thinning it all out. And we're preserving the hardwood forest. So, you know, as we're thinning out the firs, we're hoping to get some of the hardwoods back in there. And then, you know, we're staging all the piles for a big fall burn to get all that fuel out of the system. So, you know, a lot of times this work is done by inmates, job training programs. It's a real vector of disturbance that I think we need to pay more attention to if we're going to get ahead of this problem. And another thing I've been kind of passionate about is getting these native plants into people's landscapes. If we are going to type convert 85% of our land into, you know, private residences, we're going to have to start pulling from nature and integrating nature into our landscapes. And, you know, it used to be all about the drought. Now they're looking into fire-wise designs, and it's all about spacing and maintenance and breaking it up with hardscape. So here we put a big old bioswale in, all with native rock that came out with the dozers. This house had completely burned down in Glen Ellen after the Nuns fire. So it was a total landscape rebuild. And I snuck so many great natives in there. Scarlet monkey flower, juncus, snowberry, bush monkey flower. The whole pathway's got blue-eyed grass, iris, carex. I mean, we just went crazy in there. We've got spice bushes, elderberries. It's a ton of fun, and it gets people excited into, you know, interacting with their landscape and seeing wildlife come up and use these resources. It's very harmonious. And last but not least, true to Betty Young, she taught me the native nursery trade. And when I took this position for the Ecology Center, I saw the native plant nursery, and I'm like, wow, this is a big opportunity. So my wife, she's been really helpful in Phytophthora control and BMP standards, and I've learned a lot from her. And we're now implementing this at our nursery. We're ramping up our inventory, and we're hoping to have a grand opening this coming May. So we'll have resources for the community, and it's just exciting to be a part of all this. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. All right, there was a flurry of questions during when you were talking about broom, which I think speaks to the commonality of that plant in all of our lives and how widespread it is. So there's a couple of those. I'll start with a couple just notes that were dropped in the chat. You can rent broom wrenches from CNPS. There's information about that on the website. Also, there are other ways to get involved with controlling invasives through CNPS. All of that information is on our website. However, so first question, can you flame young broom sprouts? So if in the event, I would imagine, you know, a fire passes through an area, clears the main fuels on top, and then there's a resprout. Is it effective to then flame what comes back?
Yeah, you wait for the third rain. Anytime you're going to go in and introduce fire, you have to wait for the third heavy rain, and you want to get them in early in the cotyledon stage. And you use the propane torch, and I think it is highly effective. A lot of those seedlings will naturally kind of compete each other out when you actually get the young growth, but that's a great way to knock back the seed bank. And you know, one thing I didn't mention with the seed bank is a lot of times you hear these studies say, oh, the seed bank's in there for, you know, 50 years, what's the point? Well, what I've found is every time you're manually removing it, every time you're turning that earth, you're flushing the seed bank. And that's what you want. You want to get it to germinate so you can get it out of there. So I think there's really something to manual removal to get that seed bank up and out of there. And I've seen it diminish in less than 10 years. So I don't really buy into the hype of this crazy everlasting seed bank source.
That is good to hear. I have also heard that, and it is depressing, but that is great news. Couple more broom questions that are related to each other. Does the broom, and you kind of just talked about this, but does the broom taproot need to be substantially removed to kill the plant?
Yes, so you run into that when you encounter broom that's been mowed. Broom that's been mowed is not good. It's kind of the sort of thing where out of sight, out of mind, it makes you feel really good that you went in there and mowed it all. But from what I've seen, especially when you're within the fog belt, it's going to come back 100% of the time. Generally, what happens is the root doubles in size and makes the plant twice as hard to pull. It gets especially bad when it gets mowed year after year after year, and then you get these massive root balls that are then impossible to pull out with the weed wrench. And at that point, I think you're left to chemicals to control it. So I really advocate for manual removal and to avoid mowing whenever possible.
With that in mind, so grazing is not a great option for controlling broom for the same reasons that it may not, because you have to pull the whole taproot, or what do you think?
Well, I saw a broom grazing project go wrong. So that kind of tainted my whole experience with grazing and broom. And it was goats. It was goats on Mount Tam, and we penned them off, and they proceeded to decimate every single native plant in that entire pen. They stripped every madrone down on the bark and just killed everything and left all the broom. So it was a total nightmare. So, you know, I didn't focus on grazing in my research, and I kind of regret that I focused on fire, but there's so much between grazing and fire and all the complexities involved. And I think it is really timing. I mean, I've heard that livestock will eat broom, So maybe there are times where the chemical concentrations aren't quite as strong and they will go after it. Maybe they'll go after it if there's nothing else. I mean, I've heard you can do a light molasses spray and kind of entice the animals to forage on it. And actually, I've also heard that animals become trained to go after certain plants. So it's interesting. There's a lot to it. I would say timing has everything to do with it. Concentration. I would just be weary of counting on that as a blanket solution.
Right. Okay, I think that kind of sums up the broom questions, although there are some other specific questions about some of the species you mentioned. There was a question about, can you cut star thistle or does it need to be pulled by hand?
That's a great question. So, generally annuals are the ones you want to cut, and you have to cut them at just the right time. Basically, the way annual plants work is during the first few weeks of their life, they put out a ton of vegetative growth, soak up as much photosynthetic energy as they can. They put all that energy into reproduction for the following year, so you get a huge reproductive output. So if you can actually mow the plant when it's at its peak of vegetation and sever it, a lot of times the annuals won't have the energy to rebolt and put out new flower heads, new seed. But in the case of star thistle, that unfortunately isn't the case. It has a surprisingly deep taproot. And when you cut it, somehow miraculously, the flower matures when cut and makes viable seed, which I just couldn't believe. So it's a nasty one. Star thistle, we use little hand picks and we just pop them out by the root. Oftentimes it's growing in really compact soils. Sometimes we can just pull them right out with our gloves, but I like to use just the one-arm small hand pick and hit it with the pick with one arm, grab it with the other, bag it up. And we've knocked out so many emergent populations that way. I remember I had a kids group up on Mount Burdell, right at the gate right there. And we just, in the course of 4 hours, took out, probably an acre or half acre of star thistle, and it never came back. So, it the right tool for the right job and the right timing, and you can make a sizable impact. But unfortunately, mowing with star thistle, it's just like Detrichia. It'll come back at about half the height, and I'd like to say of half the reproductive output, but I'm not sure about that.
That leads right into one of the last questions. We've only got time for a couple more, but one of the questions was, do you address stinkwort Detrichia graveolens at Sonoma Ecology Center? Is that a problem weed in your area?
Yeah, I mean, Detrichia, I guess the nice thing about Detrichia is it tends to flourish when nothing else is doing much. So this time of year, it's a good time of year to focus on Detrichia. I think the verdict is still out on Detrichia. I've heard some people say that it's really just an early succession colonizer, and that it, after time, will kind of exhaust itself. That's pretty optimistic. What I've seen with Detrichia that's a little scary is it's now hopping off the roadside, entering into the grasslands, and I've even seen it in some river cobble. So, we go after it whenever we can. We tend to Sonoma Creek, so we've been doing a lot of work there on the Sonoma Developmental Center, and we're trying to protect the riparian corridor in there. So we have been going after the Detrichia in there, and other more developed areas, just chock full of so much disturbance. We can't really go after it all. I think it's very actively spread through equipment. So you see it lining the freeways. It's also a nasty one, with the dermatitis. So that seems to be hit or miss. I've pulled it without gloves and not had any issues, but I have seen, some images on the web of some pretty nasty stuff from people going after Detrichia. So definitely something you want to wear gloves with, and you probably want to bag it up And whenever we're bagging stuff up, we're using heavy duty contractor bags, so pretty thick plastic. And we actually reuse those quite a bit too. So I would advise contractor bags, hand pick, and bagging it up.
Great. Okay, so there's one more in-depth question and then one more just easy question. We've got about 5 minutes left. So one of the questions was, do you ever worry about nutrient pollution on grassland restoration sites?
Nutrient pollution. I don't know too much about that, but I think one thing I could kind of like offshoot off of that would be carbon sequestration. So one thing that I do know about is that the annuals are not sequestering the amount of carbon as the perennials. So it's a real good benefit to type convert from disturbed annual grasses to deep-rooted perennial grasses. The roots go 20 feet deep. They can live for hundreds of years, provide amazing habitat in between each of the bunches, perfect little pockets for wildflowers to germinate. So not sure about nutrient pollution. There might be ways for plants to eat up and process extra nutrients. That's an interesting concept.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that either. The last question is, where is your new nursery?
Oh, yeah, our new nursery is in a really cool place that you would never find. It is at the Sonoma Garden Park, which is in the town of Sonoma off East 7th Street. I'm working with the city to get some signs up there so people could find it. But if you Google Sonoma Garden Park, you'll find it, and it's a lovely place. It's funded by the matching grant program from the Agricultural Preservation and Open Space District, and it meets all of their needs because it's got wildland habitat, agricultural food production, and pathways and recreation. So it's just a really nice place to go have a picnic and pick some apples, really kid friendly. And we have our native plant nursery tucked in there in the back. You can't miss it if you just walk the loop. And it's coming a long way. It's gonna be great. I hope to see you guys in May.
Yeah, I'm sure folks can probably sign up for your e-newsletter and they'll see if when it's open and can track your progress through that way if they wanted to.
And I have to promote my own volunteer program. So on Saturdays from 9 to noon, if you'd like to help us propagate some plants, please do.
Great. All right, well, I think that's about all we've got time for this evening. I'd like to welcome you all to, if you want to hop on with your video and say thanks. Join me in thanking Jason for joining us this evening and giving us so much valuable information about the invasive species we've got here in Sonoma County. Yeah, round of applause. Thank you so much. I know it's strange to kind of present over Zoom, but we've quite a few folks out there, 50 people throughout this whole thing.
Fantastic.
So yeah, thank you. Hop back on.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, you guys.
All right. Thank you, Allison, too.
Oh, yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.